What is the latest on Minnesota Wild defenseman Matt Dumba? For a player who had lots of trade rumors surrounding him, could he still be moved? All the RFAs with arbitration cases are now resolved, and now the attention turns to the RFAs without arbitration rights. And could the NHL return January 1st after all? We'll discuss the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of things I want to talk about here today. Let's kick things off with the latest on Minnesota Wild defenseman Matt Dumba. Now, of course, he's a player who had a lot of trade rumors surrounding him earlier into the offseason. If you take a look at the Minnesota Wild's roster, the ways they're looking to improve on the new GM Bill Guerin, as well as their plans to protect certain players for the upcoming Seattle expansion draft that will be happening next offseason, it made a lot of sense that they would consider trading a defenseman. Obviously, they signed fellow defenseman Jonas Brodin to a long-term deal. They've already got other defensemen like Jared Spurgeon and Ryan Suter under contract for several more years. So it made sense that Dumba, who's only under contract for a few more years at $6 million, would be the type of player they'd consider moving. He's a right-shot defenseman who can provide some offense, good puck mover, and certainly would have a fair bit of value. Of course, the Minnesota Wild were also looking to add some more offense up front and really looking for a couple of star players to help take this team over from an offensive perspective to mix in with a lot of their younger players that should hopefully be big impacts here with the team as well in the next little while as they get their feet wet, like Kiprusoff as well as Marco Rossi. And of course, Kevin Fiala had a bit of a coming out party last year, but they really could use, ideally a top center iceman would be their preference, or if not, a solid number two type of guy as well. But the offers just really haven't been there, and that's why we haven't seen a trade here as of yet. So Michael Russo, the Athletic, who covers the Wild, has the latest piece indicating that at this point it's looking like a Wild trade on Matt Dumba might not be happening for a little while here yet. I mean, it's not something that we would completely rule out, but obviously the deeper we get into this offseason, the less likely we are going to see it, mainly just because there's so many teams that are tight up against the cap. There's just not a lot of teams at this point who can make it happen. Earlier in the offseason, there was more interest before teams made a lot of other moves and essentially used up a lot of their necessary space. Now, of course, at this point, for Dumba to be traded, it would take a significant contract of a pretty close to an even swap of money between the Wild and the acquiring team to make that kind of trade, which is still something you could see. Of course, we saw a scenario where teams made a lot of trades. We had a nice flurry of trade activity. We went into free agency with a big flurry of unrestricted free agents, and then that slowed down as teams turned their attention to RFAs that had arbitration rights and cases coming up on contracts, and now that's all resolved, and now we're looking back to the point where teams are kind of circling back, trying to round out their roster and see what else is left. So a player like Dumba could be on the move, but it is a lot less likely. So don't be surprised if a player like Dumba is actually held on to by the Wild and traded at a later time. I'd still think he will be moved at some point in the near future. If the Minnesota Wild aren't contending for a playoff spot, he could be a prime candidate as well for a trade deadline acquisition. Of course, he's not on an expiring contract either, so the team would have more than one crack at a solid playoff run with him in their lineup before he would become an unrestricted free agent. So there is that. That would certainly be a positive for value for what they could get in return. And if that doesn't happen, depending on how Minnesota does it, if they're in contention for a playoff spot, there's certainly the possibility they could trade him next offseason before the expansion draft. They could also go a different route and keep him, but then they'd have to go the route of protecting 8 skaters instead of 7 forwards and 3 defensemen, and that could get tricky as well because then they're going to end up exposing probably a forward that they would prefer not to, but might be less risk that way than losing a quality defenseman. But the other thing, if you look at the way the cap is structured with the flat cap, having all that money tied up on their blue line, they're going to need money to be freed up for their forward group anyway. So personally, I just don't see a long-term future for Dumba in Minnesota. I think a trade will happen inevitably here. It's just going to take a little while until the offers pick up and teams find the necessary cap space. So something that would likely takes a little bit longer before we see. So as I mentioned as well, all of the RFAs with arbitration cases have now been settled. We only had one case this year actually be settled by an arbitrator himself, and the rest were all settled between the player and the team on their own before their hearings get underway. Of course, we also had a rule this year that changed, which said that the teams could not negotiate with the player any longer once the hearing got underway, which in past years was different. They could negotiate right up until the time that the award was given by the arbitrator. Well, obviously that put a little bit more pressure on teams and players to talk and get things settled on their own, which certainly did have a positive impact in that regard. But now that all these arbitration cases have been settled, it's obviously some teams are going to have buyout windows here in the next few days. Teams like the Islanders, Rangers, Panthers, after settling their final arbitration cases, they will now get a second buyout window. So that is a possibility that we could see some players bought out here. Obviously, the Islanders are going to be tricky, as I mentioned. You know, the Rangers, I'm not sure they're going to use one. Panthers could. We may not see any, but they're going to have the option to do that. But the other attention will now be turned to the RFAs without arbitration rights, and some of these could drag on for a while as teams find ways to create necessary cap space. There is going to be trade, and there is certainly a lot of talk around some of these top teams like the Tampa Bay Lightning and like the New York Islanders, to a degree the Boston Bruins as well, because they have to create some space for the most part to get their RFAs signed. I mean, the RFAs who do not have arbitration rights, we're looking at guys like Matthew Barzal with the Islanders. You've got obviously Sergachev and Cirelli and Chernak with Tampa. You've got Jake Debrusk with the Boston Bruins. You've got Pierre-Luc Dubois with the Columbus Blue Jackets. Mackenzie Blackwood in New Jersey is another name to look at. You got Vince Dunn in St. Louis. You also have Rupe Hintz in Dallas and Dylan Strome in Chicago. Now, out of all these players, if you had to look at what would be the most likely scenarios for trade, I'd probably say Vince Dunn in St. Louis and or Jake DeBrusk in Boston. For the guys in Tampa, I think they're going to find a way to keep those RFAs and move out other players. But still, that's going to be no easy task, and we'll see what they come up with. But obviously, these RFA players are all guys who are going to need to be signed so they can play next year. And as these teams try to find the necessary space to get them under contract, we likely are going to see more moves. But some of these teams are not as tight as others, like Blackwood in New Jersey shouldn't have too hard a time getting a contract settled. To a degree, I would think Dylan Strome of Chicago shouldn't be too difficult, but so far, nothing has really come about from a contract. Seems to be close here as of yet, so that one could drag out a little while longer as well. Columbus should be pretty well positioned to sign Pierre-Luc Dubois, but of course at this point that hasn't happened either. I would say the Islanders, the Lightning, the Blues, and to a degree the Blackhawks would be the most likely teams to see making trades to squeeze in their RFAs. But the problem here is if they can't make room to sign these players could be at risk to not be signed by the time training camp hits, and which means they could miss part of next season until they can get that figured out. So I'm sure we'll see some activity here at some point, just a matter of these teams getting creative and finding ways to get it done. Now, speaking of training camps and having something to come back for, we had a pretty significant news piece here from Renaud Lavoie on Twitter today, indicating that he's heard that the NHL could be anywhere from 7 to 10 days away from announcing a January 1st return. Now, of course, we saw just in the last 24 hours or so, the NBA announcing that they came to terms with their players and their association on a return for December, so they'll be actually coming back to salvage their Christmas seasons. We know the NBA often has Christmas games, which has been a big revenue driver for them, and they're going to be able to come back and actually, take advantage of that ahead of time. There was a lot of talk it'd be at least into January before they made the comeback, like the NHL and other leagues that are currently on their off season. But right now, they're coming back sooner than later, and they're obviously doing it for a lot of financial reasons. As you can imagine, they are a business at the end of the day, and the longer this drags on, the more money they're going to lose. Now, of course, it's not really clear exactly what kind of fans are going to be able to be in attendance. I think it's going to demand... a lot of that's going to be dependent on each individual market. Of course, they're not going to be able to do a bubble concept like before, so it's going to be tricky. Of course, we don't know yet when it comes to the Canada-U.S. border how that's going to play. I mean, in the NBA's case, they only have the one Canadian team, so they could play at a neutral site if it was more convenient. But I know as well, there's also talk of an all-Canadian division in Canada for the NHL season, at least while the border closure is in place, and they could change that later on in the season if need be, because the NHL has said that how they start the season may not be the way that they end the season. They may have to make some adjustments here on the fly. But, of course, with the NBA coming back in December, they've agreed to a 72-game season. And I know some people are saying that if the January 1st return, the NHL theoretically could have a full NHL season at 82 games. But I don't know, that seems like an awful lot. To me, I think they're going to have to go with a reduced schedule. If they go January the 1st and they average 4 games a week per team, they could theoretically be done by the end of July, but that's a lot of hockey in a short period of time. And of course, the more games you have like that condensed, you put more likelihood for fatigue and injuries and whatnot. And I'm not sure we're going to see the Players Association agree to that. I think they're going to have to go with at least a little bit of a reduced schedule, maybe comparable to the NBA, 72-game season or a 68 or something to that effect. But either way, the fact that Renaud Lavoie is talking about this online, who's very well connected within the NHL, saying to expect an announcement within 7 to 10 days, certainly sounds very promising. He also says in his tweet here that there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm sure that's the case. Obviously, they have to work things worked out with the Players Association. They need to have things worked out when it comes to health officials and what the regulations are going to be. When you're dealing with a league that big and all these different markets, of course, the rules could be very different in each market, because obviously each area's government makes their own kind of local restrictions and whatnot on what they're allowed to do when it comes to fans and attendance and all that stuff. So we will see. I know the NBA said that they need to find a way to learn to live with the virus basically and survive in that kind of environment, and the NHL needs to do the same as well. Obviously, we all kind of do in some capacity. Clearly, it's a situation where we don't know when this is going to end. If they can come back with at least a limited number of fans in attendance, at least it'll help drive a little bit of ticket revenue. They can get some TV revenue as well. I know the NHL obviously is hoping to get a new contract for next year on the US TV deal, which is going to be big. So obviously having games here sooner than later will be important for that as well. So let me know your thoughts on what you think is realistic for an NHL return. The NBA is coming back in December. Does it make sense to you that the NHL could come back for January 1st? And do you see it being a possibility here that they could play a full 82-game season, possibly be done before the end of July when the Olympics would start, or maybe it even pushes this a little bit further? But I know they'd really like to get things adjusted so that they can get back to the normal hockey calendar for next year and have Seattle start on the time frame that they were originally supposed to, expansion draft and all that. So we'll see what happens. There's a lot to figure out here, but hopefully Renaud Lavoie is correct and we hear something, get some kind of an announcement within the next week or so. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.